Right, I would now like to call on the first speaker of the affirmative team to open their substantive case.
Ladies and gentlemen, out of all of the most impoverished places in the world, there are third world countries all around the world that are suffering in terms of lack of money, lack of funding, and also will be suffering from the consequences of climate change. The Pacific is one of these places that is one of the most ignored throughout the entire world. The West doesn't provide it with as much funding as it provides to other places, empirically because of, mainly because of the amount of resources that are in other places that aren't in the Pacific, and also the amount of people that are in the Pacific, and also the relative remoteness to the West that the Pacific has. What we propose to do on the affirmative side of the House to help mitigate the problems that are faced by people in the Pacific is to match the aid contribution that China is currently making to the Pacific, and we would absolutely include Fiji into this. What we're saying on the affirmative side of the House is that it would basically just be all of the countries in the West would contribute what China is currently contributing in dollar terms, the same amount of money. We feel that the West isn't going to have any problem matching this amount of money because there's so many nations in the West. Okay, we believe this for two reasons. Firstly, because of the moral imperative that the West has to provide nations in the Pacific with aid, full stop, and with more aid than they are currently providing. And secondly, because of the influence in the Pacific that China currently has or will have, and why this is actually going to be a bad thing for countries in the Pacific. We also think that both of these things contribute to the West as well, and that will be discussed by my second speaker in today's debate. Okay, first of all, the simple moral imperative. Now, firstly, Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen, the Pacific is actually overlooked by the West largely in terms of its aid objectives. The West projects this idea that we have lots and lots of aid goals, millennium goals that we want to promote throughout the world. The West wants to remove poverty, give lots of funding to healthcare, and one of the places that is slightly ignored is the Pacific. The reason why this is because it doesn't have quite the same resources or quite the same amount of people that are in other places in the West, and also because only Australia and New Zealand are particularly close to the Pacific, which make up a very small proportion of the amount of nations throughout the West that can actually provide aid. We feel that the Pacific is just in difficult circumstances as many places throughout the third world. We feel that there are plenty of places in the Pacific where they struggle in terms of getting adequate healthcare, getting adequate education to help the Pacific Islands have a really strong position throughout the world, ladies and gentlemen. And we also think that if China feels that they have a moral imperative to the Pacific, that the West absolutely has an equal moral imperative that it should match up to because of this belief. We actually believe that for the people in the Pacific, it's going to be good if there's more aid being provided, full stop. That's obvious. We feel that it's going to go to education, to healthcare, to things that they need, such as food. We also believe that the Pacific is going to be one of the places that suffers the most from the consequences of climate change. There are a number of reasons why this is going to be. First of all, because as the ice caps in the world melt, there's going to be greater flooding, there's going to be sea levels rising throughout the Pacific. Some countries in the Pacific are barely meters off the ground in terms of the whole of the nation. They barely get more than a few meters off the ground. And if the sea was to rise even by 30 centimeters, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to get serious consequences in terms of where people live, because most people in the Pacific actually live very close to the shore. And so they're really going to be in difficult positions if the water level of the sea level is rising. Things are going to have to change. Secondly, because the global warming of the Earth is also going to have significant influences on the actual climate, on weather systems. Because the Pacific Islands are surrounded by water such as the Pacific, they're going to be suffering hugely from the consequences of these changing weather systems. This means that you're going to get greater storms occurring in the Pacific, big disasters such as that happening, and we feel that that's a significant consequence that we need to care about. We also feel that the West, in this instance, has more of a moral imperative than China, because in order to develop itself to the current situation that it is, the West has benefited hugely from being able to burn coal, from being able to drive its economy through fossil fuels, which is what is driving climate change. And this is going to affect the Pacific in these ways, when the Pacific hasn't benefited significantly from it, ladies and gentlemen. The Pacific is going to suffer from what the West has done more than it's going to suffer from what China has done, certainly equally to what China has done. We feel for this reason, the Pacific, we have a moral imperative to provide the Pacific with aid in order for it to be able to adapt and perhaps mitigate the effects of climate change on it. We feel that the people in the Pacific deserve this aid, need this aid, have suffered because of what the West has done, and therefore we should provide them with this aid. Now secondly, ladies and gentlemen, because we feel, talking about influence in the Pacific. Now, if you have a situation where a nation is heavily dependent on aid, then it makes dependent on the countries that are providing that aid. If that aid is one country, ladies and gentlemen, it means that that one country can have control over that country and influence its policy, influence everything that occurs in there. We feel that in order for Pacific nations to have more independence, they need to have funding being provided from throughout the world, not just from one country, ladies and gentlemen. So if we provide funding from both the West and from China, you're going to have much more ability for these countries to have mobility in terms of how they behave, because they're not going to be so afraid of violating what China wants them to do or what the West wants them to do. There'll be equal amounts of aid being provided, so if they anger one of them, they're not going to be crippled by losing all of their aid from the one source that it's coming, ladies and gentlemen. Now thirdly, I'm going to discuss Fiji, because Fiji is a bit of an anomaly in this situation in that it is a country with a rather with a dictatorship ruling it, with anti-democratic principles ruling the nation at the moment. We have two things to say to this. First of all, that we don't think, in Fiji's case, sanctions are going to work at all. Because the person running that regime, Bainimarama, is greedy and is in a situation of power. We don't think that he's in a position where he's suddenly going to change his mind just because we're not providing aid. Secondly, and far more importantly, China is, all that happens if the West doesn't fund Fiji, is that we don't have a situation of Fiji being in a situation where it's struggling because it doesn't have any aid and it desperately needs to please other people in terms of its democracy in order to do it. What you've got is China funding Fiji. So the sanction is completely undermined and ineffective for that reason. It also compounds this problem of independence that I previously shown. It's a good example of where a nation doesn't get that independence and can only behave in a certain way as dictated by those principles. So what have I told you today, ladies and gentlemen? I've told you that we have a basic moral imperative, and I'm going to go over this in a bit more detail right now for you. Because these countries in the Pacific are struggling in terms of health, in terms of general education and welfare, and we feel that it's really important. We feel that these are things that countries throughout the world, because it's been recognised by all universally throughout countries in the Millennium Goals, that these are things that we recognise throughout the world are actually rights for individual human beings, that they should have a right to education, that they should have a right to healthcare. We shouldn't just fund countries on the basis of what they can provide to us, although we do actually feel that the Pacific does provide significant benefits to countries in the West, which is going to be discussed by my second speaker, for reasons such as the fact that we receive many immigrants from the Pacific, and also that we actually want to have greater influence in places like the Pacific to challenge China on things like that, morally on that. So for these reasons, we actually think that Pacific deserves more money in that sense, also because of the climate change which I underlined for you. We also think that it's going to be better if it's not, it's better for nations in the Pacific if they're not dependent on a single country, particularly a nation such as China, ladies and gentlemen. A nation which doesn't have particularly good record in terms of human rights. A nation that actually has a record for wanting to acquire other parts of the world, such as Tibet. We actually think that we need to protect these countries from the overdue influence from a nation such as that. A nation that has censorship issues, that does try to control its people in certain ways, and may encourage that in other countries throughout the world. We don't want a country to be dependent simply on a regime such as that. So for all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, we feel that the West should match China's aid contributions to all countries in the Pacific.